Hello, this is Gretchen Hyde. I'm with the Idaho Rangeland Resources Commission, and I have asked Toni Hardesty, who's the state director of the Idaho chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And I've asked Toni to join me today to talk a little bit about leadership. And first of all, I just really appreciate you taking the time. Your thoughts are on leadership and how you've come to this position.
Sure. Well, thanks, Gretchen. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate you thinking of me when you were thinking of leaders. So I've been with the Nature Conservancy for 6 years now as the state director here. Prior to that, for 8 years, I was the director for the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, working for 3 different governors under that scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And before that, I was in private consulting. So I did environmental consulting, working for both government and industry. And prior to that, just a short stint at the EPA. So
Mm-hmm.
I've had some experience in the federal government, private sector, state government, and now nonprofit. And I've loved having sort of the variety of background. But as a result of that, too, it's given me a lot of different opportunities to sort of observe different leaders, different leadership styles, to think a little bit about what are the things that matter most to me? What was it that I appreciated in bosses that I worked for, and in leaders that I looked at, and what did I learn from maybe those that not so much, or periods of not so much, I should say. Yeah. So I guess, it's interesting. If I had to sort of characterize my overall philosophy on leadership, I would say there's sort of 2 words that come to my mind. And one is sort of a shared leadership model. I really believe that collective input from people and from diverse points of view and perspectives always results in a better product. And so I think sitting here in an office by myself with the door closed and making a decision is not the way I go about it.
Right.
I really try to engage staff in helping both craft that vision and then figure out how to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases, I really believe that if you have a vision, different people are going to get there different ways,
Mm-hmm.
and allowing for that autonomy and that creativity and that ability for people to do that. And then I guess my other thing is I really try to be what I call responsive leadership, which is different people need different things. There's
Mm-hmm.
not a one size that fits all. And what inspires me might be very different than what inspires some of the employees, and what matters to me and how I get rewarded versus how they get rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that responsiveness, spending the time to understand that,
Mm-hmm.
spending the ability and creating the trust factor so that people will actually honestly tell you where they're at
Mm-hmm.
with a situation. I mean, I think for me, the worst thing would be to have people saying, "Oh, yes, I completely agree," and nodding their head, when in fact the whole time they're thinking,
Yeah.
"I don't agree at all." I want people to be able to tell me that. And then we work through that, and I learned something in the process, and they learned something in the process. But at the end of the day, that honesty and that transparency, and then my being able to provide the leadership that's needed based on that person and that situation. So those have been a couple of my sort of, I guess, overarching. Well, I think, one of the examples of the negative experience is, without naming names, the person who always has to be the smartest person in the room.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of leadership style, at least for me, never really worked. And I watched it not work for them.
Right.
Because people don't really engage, and they don't really try to. At some point in time, they just sort of shut down because they recognize that their opinions are not going to be listened to, or they're not genuinely valued. And so there is a lot of that, just that, head nodding, sure, whatever. And the whole time you're thinking, that's actually probably not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a way it could work, but I'm not gonna spend my time and effort and energy to get there. And you just watch that happen with people, where they really just disengage in that process. And so for me, I think it's really important as a leader to not be ego driven. I mean, I don't walk in the room and think I have to be the smartest person in the room. In fact, I think that's why I hired all of you, because you're really smart.
Yeah.
You have really great ideas, And we need to have an opportunity for those to bubble up. And I have this quote that says, leaders are not responsible for results. They are responsible for the people who are responsible for the results.
Yeah, very well done.
You know, so it's about the people. And
the hardest decisions you've had to make as a leader, and how'd you go about that?
Yeah, I think at least for me, the hardest decisions have always been when you reach the point where you're actually going to have to do a termination. Those are sleepless nights and really hard, even when you know it's right. It never comes easy. And you know, I really benefited on the positive side. I had one of the first private companies that I worked for, I think, did one of the really best jobs of just providing continual feedback. So you always knew where you were at, and you always knew what your weaknesses were and where you needed to improve. And I credit a lot of my career for people who compassionately provided hard feedback to me, you know, who said, you've got potential, but you're going to have to get better at this or you're not going to be able to move up. And so I've always embraced that, which means I've always said, you got to be honest with people. They deserve to have your honesty about where they're meeting performance, where they need to improve. And then we deserve to have the opportunity to coach them through that to get to success. But there are times in your career where no matter how much coaching you give, there are going to be those times when you just can't get there.
What do you think about evaluations? How do you do them, and what do you think is most effective?
Yeah, so I think a lot about evaluations because it's one of the things that I think is one of the most challenging things that we do. And maybe the thing that has the greatest up potential that we don't always participate in or take advantage of. So, for example, this year I asked my staff to do something different that we've never done before, and the feedback came, it was really, really great. So, I asked each of my direct reports.
Which is how many are there?
I've got 7 direct reports. So, I asked them each to reach out to at least 2 or 3 peers and ask for direct feedback from their peers.
Wow.
And I said, and you don't need to tell me what that feedback was. If you want to share it with me, that's great. But the most important thing is that you're asking for that and that you're receiving it. And I said, but don't ask for it unless you don't mean it. That person's got to know that you are genuinely interested in hearing. And so they each did. They identified 2 or 3 of their peers. They reached out to them and said, I really would like some direct feedback. And I said, here's some sample questions you could ask, but you can come up with your own. And so then we all got back together as a group, and I said, how did that go? How did that feel? And it was an overwhelming positive response. And it was 2 things that I thought was interesting. Because before, I would always solicit feedback for them, and oftentimes from their peers, of course. And people said we were more honest when we were giving the feedback directly to that person than we were when we gave it to you about that person. And they said we were more thoughtful in how we provided that feedback too. And then the big positive that I think everybody took away too was it gave you an opportunity to ask follow-up. So when you got that feedback to say, okay, help me understand that or explain it. So that was something we did this year. People really liked it. We're going to try to continue that process because it was really positive for people. So I think sort of reaching outside of the box, but again, it's also losing control, right? Like, it's like, okay, and you have to be willing as a leader to.
So how did you take that as in terms of where they are and using that information? What's the next step for that?
And I think what was the beautiful thing is every single one of them said, no, I'm happy to share with you the feedback I got. And so then we sat down, and of course I had provided feedback from my perspective, and then we combined that feedback with what they heard directly from their peers, and said, okay, so you tell me, what do you think now based on what you've heard from me and what you've heard from your peers? What are the things that you both want to, continue doing, things you want to improve on, any professional development? And so it was actually quite.
That sounds really great.
It was really great. Yeah.
Really